everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we are going to go over Chapter 18 from The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And this chapter is titled Character and Its Defects in Childhood. Now, as we approach a chapter like this, I want to remind everyone that Montessori wrote these books late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's been a long time. And when we are reading chapters like this, there may be some language that is out of date. And I thought about which way I wanted to go with this, whether or not I would want to switch out wording or keep the wording that's in the book. And I've decided that I'm going to keep the wording that is in the book, and I'm going to give it to you directly how it is written in The Absorbent Mind. And I understand if you are presenting ideas from this chapter to parents or people in your community, I understand if maybe you want to switch out some words because they are outdated and they may come across as insensitive. I do want you to take a look at the language from a point of view that is not of modern day society, that it doesn't have the negative connotations to it back then that it does now. And so when we talk about character and defects and other type of language that might be really sensitive to other people, I just hope that people realize that we are reading from a time period that had very different language. And I know that the education community has worked very hard on what language they would prefer to use and what language they feel is more sensitive. I feel like for these videos, it is important to give you the quote from the book directly, and then you can adapt it to your community how you would like. So in my book, we're going to start on page 173. And this talks about forming character. And we're going to talk about how the Montessori environment forms character, because building character is a really important part of the curriculum in Montessori. And I think that that's something that maybe a lot of people who aren't familiar with Montessori, they might miss that detail. In all of our lessons, particularly in the practical life area, we really work towards forming the character of the child. And so this is an important subject. We do talk about the formation of the personality, and we also talk about the different types of personalities that we see in our environments. And this is really important because we're not just teaching academics, we're teaching virtues. So on page 173, Montessori starts by saying, "We must now turn to the second group of facts, which have importance during the first years of life, those concerning the child's character and its formation. Certain virtues have always been highly valued: courage, perseverance, the sense of duty, good moral relationships with others, and a high place has always been given to more education. Philosophers and biologists have debated the matter from early time, but always failed to reach a precise definition. There is no ultimate concept acceptable to all. Yet intuitively, everyone knows the importance of that sum total of qualities that goes universally under the same name." On page 174, Montessori goes on to talk about the stages of development. She says, "Our interest is therefore turned towards the observation and interpretation of the work that nature does in the construction of man on his psychological side. No doubt, a theory such as this must be able to interpret character at every stage from childhood to maturity. But for the moment, let us take the child's unfolding life as the basic factor and make this our guide to the infinite variations among individuals which are caused by their efforts to adapt." So right here, what she's talking about is that the stages of developing character can be broken up into stages from childhood to maturity. And we're going to look at this from the context of the different planes of development that Montessori came up with. So the first plane being 0 to 6, then 6 to 12, and then 12 to 18. So every 6 years we go through this different formation, this different type of development. And so what happens when we're developing character changes very much in each stage of development, and she's going to go on to explain that further in this chapter. So on pages 174 to 175, she talks about the planes of development. So let's talk about that first plane of development, ages 0 to 6. And she said this is all about creativeness. She says the roots of character lie here, even though at birth the child has no character. The most important part of life, and this applies to character development as well. So this is an extremely important part of the entire process of creating character because we have this creation stage. And all the roots start here with our development of character. And while there is a definite part for biology, we know that in this stage of 0 to 6, that there are a lot of things that children are absorbing during this time, and that's going to impact all the other stages of development. When we get to the plane of development of ages 6 to 12, we're going to start talking about moral consciousness. She says the child begins to become conscious of right and wrong. This not only in regards to his own actions, but also the actions of others. Problems of right and wrong are characteristic at this age. Moral consciousness is being formed, and this leads later to social sense. So this is really what this stage of development is focused on. And if you teach in that 6 to 12 environment, or if you are a parent who has a child in the 6 to 12 age group and a child in the 0 to 6 age group, you might be noticing that there is this change, right? This idea of right and wrong, of moral consciousness starts to happen in this second plane of development. And they start working out this idea of moral consciousness in their life within themselves and, of course, within the community. And that's when they really start to look outside themselves and outside of their very tight community and further into the world. And then in the ages of 12 to 18, that third plane of development, the love of country is born. She says the feeling of belonging to a national group and of the concern for the honor of that group. And I think this is really interesting because here in the United States, we just had a very intense election. What are we seeing in those 12 to 18-year-olds? And what are we looking at in terms of this feeling of belonging to a national group? As we take a deeper look at our society and we look at what's going on in the ages of 12 to 18, and especially what we're seeing in terms of an election year, you can take a look at the 12 to 18-year-old age group and see how profoundly they are being shaped and affected by what's going on around them, what their community is saying, what the media is saying, right? They are very much influenced by people they might idolize. They are looking for idols at that age, and they're very susceptible to those idols that they have chosen for their life. They're looking for somebody to mold their life after. And this is a very sensitive time that's going to affect their love of country or how they feel towards their country. On page 175, Montessori talks about protecting the future. She says each period is basically different from the other two. Nevertheless, each lays the foundation for the one following it. To develop normally in the second period, a person must have developed well in the first. We serve the future by protecting the present. The more fully the needs of one period are met, the greater will be the success of the next. When we think about, when we're meeting the needs in that first plane of development, if that develops normally, then we can move on to that second plane of development where they're talking about moral consciousness. And if that develops well, if that develops normally, then in that third plane, they're going to develop the love of country, a more national feeling, a bigger community feel. But what happens when one of those planes of development does not develop normally? We can see that there is an obstacle that's put in their way that may prevent them from figuring out what's going on from moral consciousness in the second plane of development, or what's going on in terms of being able to adapt to the larger culture as a whole on maybe a national level. On page 176, she talks about the consequences of early experiences. And we know that early experiences are extremely important and that what happens in early experiences can affect a child their entire life. And this is really where you're going to see Montessori lining up with Freudian theories. And she says, after birth begins the critical years that we have just been studying. In the first 2 or 3, the child may undergo influences that will alter his whole future. It follows that the child's character develops in accordance with the obstacles he has encountered or the freedom favoring his development that he has enjoyed. As to prognosis, or the hopes we may entertain of correcting children's defects, We may place those acquired in the postnatal period from 0 to 3 as being curable in practice during the period from 3 to 6, when nature is still busy in the perfecting of many newly formed powers. But if the defects caused between 0 and 3 were not then corrected, not only do they remain, but also they get worse. All these defects have their repercussions on mental life and on intelligence. Children find it hard to learn if circumstances in the previous period have been inimical to the unfolding of their power. He may, for example, be unable to develop the moral awareness that should appear between 6 and 12. So, as she's stating here, as we're thinking about it, when we're having obstacles placed in our path between the ages of 0 to 3, we can correct a lot of that in that 3 to 6 age group. But really, it starts to compile if we're not correcting them. When we start getting into that 6 to 12-year-old age group, it becomes a lot harder to correct anything. Children aren't absorbent like they are in the ages of 0 to 6. And so you are going to see these repercussions, and they are going to find it harder to learn than in the previous period. So on pages 177 to 178, Montessori starts talking about the strong child versus the weak child. And this is something that she talks about quite a bit. And it's really a very interesting subject. And again, the language can be a little difficult to maybe pick up on or understand the first time through. So I want to go through this as carefully as possible, but if you have any questions about strong versus weak child language or ideas, leave me a comment down below, because this really can be a tricky one to navigate. And if you're not reading the whole book in context, it might be a difficult idea to follow. So we're going to start on page 177 and try to work our way through this. She says, "It is usual to discuss children's defects one at a time, but numerous though they are, we find it better to classify all of them under two simple headings: those shown by strong children who resist and overcome the obstacles they meet, and those shown by weak children who succumb to unfavorable conditions." In the first group are capriciousness and tendencies to violence, fits of rage, insubordination, and aggression. Disobedience is marked, and a so-called destructive instinct. Children of the weak type are passive by nature, and their defects are negative. Indolent and idle, they cry for what they want and try to get others to wait on them. They are always wishing to be entertained and are easily bored. They find everything frightening and cling to grown-ups. They are often untruthful, which is a passive form of defense, or they steal things. Now, as I read this, if you're like me and you have been teaching for a while and working with students for a while, there are probably several faces that just came to your mind as I read this. You're probably already thinking about that one child. And this is a very natural response, because we do have some very, very difficult children. And the one thing that Montessori brings to light in this observation, and she'll go further into it, is that it's not just the really difficult children that are not normalized. These weak children are often very well behaved. They're not always crying and clingy, and when they are crying and clingy, often a grown-up might actually enjoy that. It makes them feel needed, right? And so this weak personality kind of feeds sometimes an adult's defects too. And so the weak child can be a favorable child, where the strong child is pretty much never favorable. That's usually one where most teachers are like, oh my God, just let me get through the day without having a total meltdown or destructive incident with this child, right? Those are very much, we easily classify this as a problem that needs to be dealt with when we have very disruptive, very destructive students in our class. But a very weak child also has a lot of problems as well. And a lot of the times we nurture that weakness, because it can often be something that we find very rewarding as an adult. And so we have to watch out for both extremes in our classroom, and we also have to evaluate who we are as adults and understand whether or not we are feeding into something that's healthy or unhealthy within our students or within our family. On page 178, Montessori talks more in depth about the strong child. She says, not felt to be blessings about the house, the parents try to get rid of them, willingly entrust them to nannies or send them to school. They become orphans with living parents. The parents wonder what to do with them. Some seek advice, others try to solve the problem alone. Sometimes they decide on severity, thinking this will settle everything. They use all kinds of means, smacking, shouting, sending them to bed hungry, but the children only get worse and become more troublesome. Tactful persuasion is then tried. They are reasoned with, or appeal is made to their affections, like, why do you make mommy so unhappy? Finally, the parents are defeated and stop worrying. So I'm just wondering right now if anybody has had that experience, if any of you have had that observation. Because a lot of the times when you have a very difficult children, a parent can check out. They can try everything and it doesn't seem to make a difference and they check out. And what Montessori is talking about here when she is addressing this, she is not addressing this in a bubble. She's looking at this from the standpoint of what is it that this child needs to become normalized again? And that's really where we start looking at Montessori as a therapy. Now, not so much in the United States, the Montessori therapy hasn't really been introduced here. It actually is introduced in Germany. I'm not sure other parts of Europe, but Germany does have a Montessori therapy program. The Medical Montessori Partnership for Inclusion, they have training on some of these Montessori therapies. But as you start reading chapters like this, you're going to realize that Montessori is more than just a teaching method. It definitely, with her philosophies on the weak child and the strong child and all of these different types of issues when we're talking about developing character and moral consciousness, we are very much talking about how to use a curriculum as a therapeutic technique. And so as we go through it and we keep reading more about character, I want you to keep that in mind. On page 179, Montessori talks about the weak child. She says their behavior is not a problem. The mother thinks her child is good and obedient because he does nothing wrong. His clinging to her she takes to be affection. He loves her so much, she says, that he won't go to bed without her. But later on, she notices that his movements and speech are backward. He is uncertain on his feet. His health, she says, is good, but he is so sensitive. Everything frightens him. Child specialists make fortunes from these maladies of the mind. Grown-ups may have done everything for them, thus preventing them from carrying out their own cycles of activity. The result is passivity and inertia. And I find this to be more profound than the observation on the strong child, because the strong child has always been fairly easy to identify in life. But when we're talking about this idea of the weak child, we often reward the weak child. And part of the reason why the weak child is harder to identify is because they don't have their own will. They haven't developed their willpower. They allow themselves to be subverted by other people's willpower. And so they can experience psychosomatic issues. Somebody who did really interesting work with this is Salvador Minuchin on structural therapy. His work is really interesting, and he worked particularly with children with psychosomatic issues. And so you'll see that the restructuring of the family unit to not enable a child who is very weak can actually solve these psychosomatic illnesses in children. And so Salvador Minuchin's work on this really emphasizes what Montessori is saying there. So if you have time and you want to go look up some books on structural therapy with Salvador Minuchin, his work is really quite interesting in regards to what she's talking about here with some of the things that may come up when a child has this passivity. On page 179, Montessori talks about the starvation of the mind. She says if children have been neglected at this time, their minds are empty because they have had no chance to build up their contents. This starved mind is a basic cause of many evils. Another cause is the lack of spontaneous activities directed by the creative impulse. Often, they have been left entirely alone with little to do but sleep. Irrational fears also have causes traceable to this early period. And this is really, again, going back to that Montessori therapy idea, where she gives them purposeful work, and a child's work is different than an adult's work. And we have to fill their days with work that's appropriate for the development of the child. We often talk about the control and coordination of movement, connecting the hand to the mind. Their work has to be physical in the 0 to 6 age group. It's not until they get into the 6 to 12 age group that their work becomes more abstract, where it's isolated mainly to the mind and not so much to the physical development. And when we don't give them purposeful work, we're going to see a lot of things happening in that early age group that's going to cause a lot of problems later on. On page 179, she talks about the solution for this. And as I stated, it's going to be more along the lines of this idea of Montessori therapy. Montessori therapy being worked out in our classrooms. And she says one of the chief reasons for the spread of our schools has been the visible disappearance of these defects in children as soon as they found themselves in a place where active experience upon their surroundings was permitted and where free exercise of their powers could nourish their minds. Surrounded by interesting things to do, they could repeat the exercises at will and went from one spell of concentration to another. Once the children had reached this stage and could work and focus their minds on something of real interest to them, their defects disappeared. So the solution is proper work, appropriate work. Now, I think a lot of us know that that's the case now. I don't think that this is an unusual concept in our society. I think it was unusual for her time, but this is pretty well accepted now. And that's why we have so many preschools. That's why we have so many kindergartens. That's why we have so many lobbyists in the early childhood industry. But a lot of the times we don't go far enough, because a lot of the times what we're giving in preschool and kindergarten is a lot of pretend, a lot of play, a lot of fantasy. And that's where Montessori is really beautiful, because we don't allow them to pretend to make food. We actually make food. They don't pretend to do their dishes. They really do dishes. And if they drop a plate, there's a consequence. It breaks. It's not plastic. And so they have to learn to clean it up, and they have to learn to be careful with their bodies, because if they clean up broken glass, it's sharp and there's a consequence. And so when we're talking about the activity that children have in that 0 to 6 age group, not just nourishing their mind with academic ideas, but work that has some real consequence to it. And now they build up to that. I don't let my 3-year-olds clean up, sweep up broken glass, but a 6-year-old that I know has worked really hard in the classroom, developed control and coordination and responsibility and leadership. Yeah, a 6-year-old can definitely do it. And these things interest children. And I think that that's where traditional schools differ from Montessori as well. We don't realize what children are most interested in. They're interested in doing something real, but they'll definitely settle for pretend if that's all they have. And so we lower our expectations for children by simply giving them fantasy and not giving them ways to do real work. So on page 180, we're going to talk a little bit about closing thoughts for this chapter. And Montessori says children need to work at an interesting occupation. They should not be helped unnecessarily nor interrupted once they have begun to do something intelligent. Man is an intelligent being and needs mental food almost more than physical food. Unlike the animals, he has to build up his own behavior. And let's think about that for a second. Children should not be helped unnecessarily. I don't know about you, I'm definitely guilty of that. My background before Montessori is early childhood education, and it's all about helping unnecessarily. It's all about interrupting children during their concentration, because we have this belief in early childhood that it's all about the teacher and how the teacher entertains the children in the classroom, but not in Montessori. In Montessori, we focus on children focusing on the work. The teacher is insignificant at that time. If we link the child to the material, to the work, we disappear, and all that exists to our student is the work in front of them. Montessori had this great quote. She said, "The children are now working as though I don't exist." Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could get to a place in education where that's true on every level, where teachers link them to their work, set up an example, a presentation of the work to be done, and then disappear? Because the students are so engaged in their work, the teacher has become unnecessary. The teacher has become insignificant. All we're supposed to do in the Montessori environment is link them to the work, provide the opportunity. We need to not make it about us. We need to not help them unnecessarily. And once they start focusing something, we need to not interrupt them. Never interrupt your student if they're doing something intelligent. Because we need mental food, she says, almost more than physical food. Animals don't have to build up their character. They don't have to build up those virtues. Humans do. And so we have to look at this as an important part of our curriculum. And a lot of that has to do with us as the adults not overstepping our boundaries and giving proper opportunities to our students and to our children. And so this really comes back to a reflection on us, the adult. How are we becoming obstacles to the students in our life, to the children in our life? Do we interrupt them when they're doing intelligent work? Do we constantly break their concentration? Are we constantly making sure that they are never able to be independent from us? These are the things I want you to think about when you're reflecting on what you could improve in your environment, whether it's the classroom or your home environment. So that's an overview of chapter 18, and there's a lot more to that chapter. So please go back and read the whole chapter in context because there's a lot more that she says in that chapter. But this is the overview. This is the idea of this chapter. And this gets into a little bit of that psychology of the strong child versus the weak child. And we'll discuss this more in later chapters when she talks about fugues and barriers. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. And don't forget to share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.